I am here talking to Meagan Day and Micah Uetricht. They are the co-authors of the new book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Movement to Democratic Socialism. And I thought, reading this book, that I would be depressed because I was reading it shortly after the end of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and part of me doesn't want to read that much about Bernie because I want to think, what do we do next? How do we not dwell on this unfortunate end to what was such a promising campaign? And then I discover that is exactly the subject of the book. And when the book says bigger than Bernie, it really means it. And I have now discovered that it is precisely the book that I recommend that people pick up in this particular moment if they are interested in this question, because your book, even though at the time that it was published, you didn't know the outcome of what the Bernie Sanders campaign would be, the book does not presume that Bernie will win. And the book is a lot more about, no matter what the outcome of the election, what the Bernie moment has meant. And it is kind of thinking through all of the dilemmas that leftists now face. So you shouldn't be discouraged by seeing the word Bernie on the cover. And in fact, if you are a leftist who is confused and alone and wondering how we pick up the pieces and move on, I think this is what you intended the book to be.
Well, Nathan, I appreciate you saying all of those very nice things about the book. But before we start,
oh yes, you have an anecdote.
I wanted to tell you something that you and I don't think even Meagan are aware of, which is that you were the inspiration for initially writing this book, because I was reading. I'm a high volume Nathan Robinson consumer. I've read 3 of your books at this point.
Whoa!
And I was reading your Trump book. And your Trump book is very good. You talk about how good your Trump book is. And I was reading it, and it's a very good book, but it's just like Nathan Robinson's thoughts on Trump. There was not some. You don't have a PhD in Trumpology. I don't know. You're just like, here's what I think about Donald Trump, and what your reflections are on Trump are very good. So I was reading that, and I was like, wow. I could just do this about like Bernie, and like at first it was going to be like what the lessons were from Bernie, and then of course as time went on it was like, oh, we need to do something that's bigger than Bernie. But it was reading your book that gave me the idea to first look at this. So thank you.
My central contribution to the world of writing, I feel like, is to show people that you don't actually have to have any formal expertise in what you are talking about in order to have a career in talking about it.
That's right. Thank God for that.
So, yeah, no. Well, in that case, I'm very glad I wrote that book. If it had any role at all in persuading you, the advice I always give to writers is like, if David Brooks and Thomas Friedman can have professional careers where they are paid to write, then you, no matter what you have to say, are like 10 times more insightful than people who do this for a living already. So for God's sakes, get your thoughts out. We need them.
Well, actually, this does. I mean, Mike, I remember you did actually tell me that, but it's so long ago because the book has gone through so many mutations. Because that was when you were originally thinking about writing it by yourself, and you were planning on it being entirely what we kind of jammed into the first chapter, which is like, what are the lessons that we can draw from Bernie and his career? And then as we started working on it together and trying to figure out what kind of book would be necessary by the time a book like this came out, what kind of interventions we should be making, we just ended up cramming all of that into the first chapter and spending the rest talking about what we think are the broad outlines of how socialists and progressives should behave in the era post the Bernie 2020 campaign, no matter what the outcome looked like, whether that was a win or a loss. And so I'm glad to hear, Nathan, that it sounds like you picked up on that yes. We were trying to boil it down.
What's cool is, Micah, you were kind enough to review my Why You Should Be a Socialist book under what is, I think, my favorite title of any article about the Evan, which is Socialism Butterfly, which I don't know if you picked, but I
No.
now informally consider myself the Socialism Butterfly. But one of the critiques that you made that was a totally valid critique, and is the critique that a lot of people said, is, well, you're right that people should be socialists, and very persuasive on that point, but how do we achieve socialist political goals? Where do we go? That is something that I am more amorphous on. But you basically, in this book, pick up what is the difficult question that I kind of avoid, and a lot of socialists often avoid because it's extremely difficult. And you're willing to tackle the impossible, which is thinking, how do we take our powerful and good and persuasive socialist ideals and think about in the real world, the real messy world of politics.
Yeah, it's true that actually we don't spend that much time making the case for why you should be a socialist. That if people want that, your book is a much better place to look for it. We're just sort of assuming that you've been convinced, you the reader have been convinced of this either by reading Nathan Robinson's book or by the Bernie Sanders campaign, and that you're ready to act on it. And we're trying to give people a sense of how we think that we should go about it from now on.
So when you think about how do we do socialism in the real world, you go through the basic that you go through the history of socialism in the United States, and you reject the off-stated conclusion that the United States has a unique allergy to socialism that is impossible to get rid of. And you point out that, in fact, there have been socialist political victories in the United States, but there is also plenty of reason to believe that the laws of the political and economic world that apply universally do not suddenly become suspended within the borders of this country.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the central lessons from the Bernie campaign, right? Is because that argument that Americans are somehow uniquely allergic to class politics, allergic to socialism, has always been trotted out, including by lots of liberals or progressives who would say, well, of course it would be great if we could have Medicare for all. Of course it would be great if we could do some wealth redistribution. Of course, all of those things that you, the socialists, say you want, it'd be great if we could have those. But unfortunately, we're stuck in a situation where, as you said, there are these sort of immutable, eternal laws governing how Americans do politics. And we just can't, we can't run afoul of those laws, and those laws include the fact that people are allergic to class politics. And of course, if nothing else that we've gotten from the Bernie campaign, we've learned that is false. That should also make us wonder, like, why have we believed all these people who have made this argument this whole time that Americans will never go for this stuff? Maybe they actually never wanted to go for it in the first place, at least some of them. And so we've seen through the Bernie campaign that people are excited about a bold class politics, like literally millions of people. And in fact, that we may be at a time in America in which people are, the label like Democratic Socialist is not actually a super harmful to figures like Bernie and other people who are going to go out into the world inspired by him, but actually because people are so hungry for a change in the status quo, like a break from the way that we do politics typically, that they understand has failed them. Maybe people claiming the Democratic Socialist label is actually beneficial rather than harmful, because people who claim that label are, speaking to the fact that the status quo has failed us so badly, and that we do need a radical shift in our politics in this country.
But let me ask you this, because a lot of the analysis that I see coming out in places like Vox and the Washington Monthly just ran a thing now, the post-Bernie analysis says the consensus is it shows the failure of socialist politics. It shows the Democratic electorate rejecting left politics. And, your perspective, and mine, is that actually this was quite a successful and impressive campaign. But what do you say to someone who comes in and goes, you're crazy, you just lost, you lost, so clearly all of this stuff about how socialism is viable in the United States, we tested it, we ran the experiment, and it failed.
I mean, it's pretty stark the double standard, right? Like, electoral failure can only be a referendum on the viability of left politics, never a referendum on the viability of centrist politics. Gore, Kerry, Clinton, or all of the centrists who failed to secure the nomination in 2020, these cannot be referenda on the viability of the political theory that animates those campaigns. But when the left makes an attempt and gets close to a taste of power and then loses it, suddenly from all corners you hear, well, we gave that one a shot and it didn't really work out, so it's time for you all to take your ball and go home. I think we just need to reject that and just point out the hypocrisy. I mean, you see it in the UK as well, and actually this is something that I want to address. If we're in a better position having lost the primary than we would be if we had won the primary and then lost the general for this exact same reason. Like, if you think that we're seeing a lot of articles now about how, we've tested Bernie Sanders' theory of politics and the American people rejected it, it would be so much worse if Bernie had gone up against Trump and lost. I'm not saying that I think Bernie would have lost against Trump. As Micah eloquently put it, I believe, on social media, Bernie would have won once again. but
He would have won.
He will would have won. I don't know if Joe Biden will win. I don't know if Bernie would have won against Trump, but I know that if Bernie had lost against Trump, this tendency to take all electoral failures on the left and transform them into symbols of the complete unviability of leftist politics would have been not just in full force, but would have been hung around our necks like a millstone, possibly for decades to come. So I think that we may have dodged a bullet, which isn't to say that I wouldn't have wanted to proceed into a general election, because I do think that it's possible that we could have won, which would have been better.
Bernie Sanders became such a singular figure and vehicle for people's aspirations. I remember there were Clinton people in 2016, when Bernie at the convention where Hillary got nominated, who were mocking the Bernie supporters who were like crying at the convention, and I remember that moment thinking, well, you really don't understand what this campaign has meant to people, because it has seemed for many like literally the only thing. Right, it has been such a dark political landscape if you are a leftist, that Bernie Sanders as a person, as much as we don't want it to be a personality cult, and as much as your book is dedicated to helping us think beyond Bernie, for many people, Bernie was unique, and Bernie's loss is singularly devastating.
Yeah, and we, to be clear, don't want to pretend like we have not just suffered a devastating loss. I mean, Meagan and I both threw ourselves into the campaign. We wrote this book because we think that Bernie has played this really singular role in transforming American politics. And the fact that he lost set the left back very significantly. It is much worse to have lost than to have won. But I also, there's this kind of thinking that's emerged on some sections of the left since Bernie suspended his campaign that is like the only truly intellectually rigorous response to this loss is to just engage in constant self-flagellation, and just whenever anybody tries to say, well, actually the left is, yes, we did lose, but also the left is in better shape than it's been in half a century. We're like, no, like all we can talk about is how devastated this movement was. It was all tied up in Bernie Sanders, and he lost. And so now we have squandered any opportunity that we have to make, the kinds of political transformations that we all know that we need in this country. And I think that is both like, it's kind of politically useless. I mean, it just means that you should just sit around and wallow in your grief and never emerge from it. But it's also intellectually dishonest. It is not actually taking stock of the changed political landscape that we now occupy. If you were a socialist 5 years ago, as I was, you were completely isolated in American life. You had no toehold in mainstream politics. There was no vibrant socialist movement for you to be a part of. There were no electoral standard bearers who you could line up behind. Somebody pointed out to me the other day that there was a Jacobin editorial from 5 or 6 years ago that talked about being on the left and doing sort of like, talking about theory in a way that was like very off-putting to people. That socialists who were like out and proud about their socialist politics in an off-putting way were compared to like masturbators on the subway. It was just like totally inappropriate and bizarre and awful behavior to engage in. Versus now, 5 years later, like no one, the Vox and the New York Times feel the need to shit on us and tell us why our ideas about the socialist, how to do socialist politics are very, very wrong. But they weren't even paying it. They didn't feel the need to tell us we were wrong 5 years ago. I mean, the truth is that we have made significant progress potentially towards a long-term transformation of U.S. politics, and we should recognize that rather than solely engaging in weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Can I add to that I think that there's a tendency to compare, like when you're thinking about whether or not this was a successful campaign, people only want to compare it to what it would have been like if Bernie had won and would occupy the White House starting next year. But you could also compare it to 5 years ago, or to if Bernie had not run at all. And so I think that we need to do like a sort of more balanced accounting of what we've won and lost, and not simply compare it to the lost opportunity of not having Bernie Sanders be our president. It's also the case that if Bernie had not run, or if he had run and performed way worse than he did in both of these contests, then we would be in a much worse position. I've been attempting to do like a pro and con tally in my mind, because like Micah, I've been really taken aback actually by this tendency whenever I've expressed any sort of like positivity coming out of the failed Bernie campaign. Electoral failure, of course. Whenever I've expressed any positivity about what we've built, there's this kind of like response that's either like we failed Bernie or Bernie failed us, and it's like emphasizing one or the other, or sometimes a combination of both. And that seems to be like it's very negative. There's a very negative tenor out there, and I'm not sure that that's accurate is the thing. It's like it's not that I don't think that if it were accurate we should avoid it. I mean, I think that obviously I agree with some of the there have been some criticisms of like kind of like vague platitudes like we'll get them next time, folks. Like obviously that's not the kind of intellectual rigor we should be bringing to this moment either. But really, if you tally it up, we lost some major stuff. We lost the ability to have a champion for workers and for the climate in the White House, which means that we lost the ability to have meaningful climate action and pro-worker action emanating from the White House. And that's a huge loss, especially as we're looking at looming climate change, and we're looking at this new economic crisis from which it is only possible to emerge if one has the political tools that someone like Bernie Sanders has. We're in for some untold suffering because Bernie Sanders did not win the presidency. Yes. Not to mention just the standard grinding misery of working class life in the United States. But then on the other hand, we have in fact popularized a new political program. I was not, like Micah, I was not an organized socialist. Unlike Micah, I was not an organized socialist prior to Bernie Sanders running the first time, but I was sort of like aware of the left. I mean, I like participated very vaguely in Occupy, for example, and I don't remember us having a program. I don't remember us having anything to unite around, and in fact, that was what allowed me to kind of drift off and do my own thing for years after having participated in this mass protest movement, right? So that's changed. We have a new program to unite around, and we also, I think, have won a real imaginative victory, which is that we have convinced people that they deserve more they could reasonably expect more from the society that they're living in. I think that we've convinced millions of people of that, actually. Yeah. I really do.
Well, and with coronavirus, I now see people who I never would have expected to, pretty mainstream liberal commentators, saying the talking points that the left was trying to push during the primary kind of unsuccessfully, going, employer-sponsored health insurance is throwing millions of people off their health insurance, and understanding now that the points that we were trying to make about the perils of the private insurance system were all correct. Now, it's unfortunate that revelation has come, and the moment where all of the things that Bernie was saying have become so clear has come right at the moment where he has lost the nomination. But it does mean that, I do feel this kind of awakening moment where now when you talk to people about left ideas, you have to do far less work than I remember having to do to get people to go, oh yes, no, I totally get it.
Yeah, and our book is about seizing that potential because it's there. I mean, we've won this sort of the initial battle of just getting people to believe that actually society can be different. Actually, these policies are credible. These politics are credible. That's like the first and maybe the most important step towards making those transformations. So, we should be sober about the obviously all the difficulties we're going to face, especially without Bernie. But like we've taken the first step in that direction.
Well, the goalposts are moved on us so quickly. I mean, I remember. As you mentioned, we were in the wilderness for so long, but if you look at the political career of Bernie Sanders himself, so many runs for office where he gets 2% of the vote, 3% of the vote, then squeaks into being, mayor of Burlington, which you write about his time as mayor of Burlington in the book, and how it kind of gives an example of applying socialist principles as an executive in a limited domain. But, mayor of Burlington's a small-scale office compared to a global socialist revolution. But then, U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and now, top-tier U.S. presidential candidates setting the whole conversation, right? I mean, just objectively speaking, and you see these articles in Politico saying, a bunch of our revolution endorsed candidates lost. Only 2 out of however many won. And to me, I think every time we win a victory, it's incredible for us. And I've written about going to the DSA convention last summer and seeing the press conference with all the DSA successful candidates from around the country in local elected office, people in the state legislature, people on the city council, people on the library board, all of whom are socialists in office today.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the idea that, this goes back to the previous conversation about you can only have a referendum on the viability or unviability of leftist politics. Our revolution did not perform spectacularly well in 2018. Okay, why would we expect in the beating heart of global capitalism that an insurgent progressive movement was going to perform really well 2 years after its debut onto the national stage in the form of a Bernie Sanders presidential campaign?
An anti-capitalist did not become the head of the largest imperial army and global capitalist system though the humanity has ever known. Can you believe that?
What a failure!
Yeah.
Well, I think another thing that I want to say too is that we've put something. Look, I'd rather be winning material victories than ideological ones, but I also think that we shouldn't be crude about the idea that to insist that there is no relationship between the two. It would be better, for example, if we were significantly increasing worker control in workplaces from the White House itself. That is what I would rather be happening. But it's also the case that we are actually changing people's sense of what's possible, building their confidence, and that is setting them into motion to put themselves in positions where they're building new relationships or developing new skills, and they're actually taking power in their workplaces or they're running for office, and that is important. And I do think that the Bernie Sanders campaign has played a huge role in setting people into motion differently and will continue to, and that'll have exponential effects. And one of the main victories that the campaign has affected is, I think, breaking the kind of spell of capitalist realism. This is a term from the theorist Mark Fisher. It sort of describes just the pervasive sense that there really is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher put it, to neoliberalism. That quote comes from Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s when she was implementing her agenda of austerity and privatization, and there were mass protests, and the press asked her, hey, Margaret Thatcher, people really hate what you're doing. What do you want to say to them? And she just responded, there is no alternative. People understand that this is just what, there's nothing you can do about it. You better just accommodate yourself to it as an individual, right? So I do think that in the United States, the ascent of Reagan pretty much inaugurated the same process here. And it's nothing to sneeze at to have people actually discussing and really feeling the potential for an alternative, if not on a mass social scale, though many Bernie are actually talking about an alternative to capitalism, at least on an individual scale. Like, there is an alternative to me being paid wages that are so low that I literally cannot afford my living costs, even though I work constantly. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the depressing thing was that for so long it seemed as if Margaret Thatcher was correct in the sense that both parties had signed on to this ideology and this kind of the one-way ratchet where things could only ever go in this one direction, where you could only ever even imagine benefits being cut. You could only ever even imagine government services being scaled back. You could only ever even imagine a tax cut. There was one direction to think, and you could slow it down, perhaps, but it was this inevitable process. And even, I mean, and the kinds of Democrats that still are mostly in office, you can only ever even imagine a response to a crisis that gives out, $1,200 checks eventually in however many weeks. Or you could only ever imagine, we would, of course, you can't imagine keeping people in their jobs. It has to be, maybe some meager unemployment assistance. They really had, Democrats were so pitiful and pathetic that it was impossible to imagine even having solutions that match the scale of the problems. Everything would have to be like, I think the perfect example was, remember Kamala Harris's student debt cancellation plan, where it was like she canceled debt for people who'd opened a business in a struggling community and kept it afloat for 3 years. They get $10,000. That kind
Only
of
if they
like,
took out their loans on Tuesdays after noon.
But that was the only thing you could ever imagine a policy being, almost.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah, we don't have to go back. Thank God. Let's go forward.
There's a new sense of ambition, at least in political culture, and I have another point to this effect that I've been beating this drum for like a week now. Whenever anybody asks me what I think about what Bernie Sanders has accomplished, I'm not seeing enough counterfactuals. Like, what if Bernie Sanders hadn't run? The truth of the matter is that we had a explosion of populist energy coming out of the Great Recession in this country, and it did not have a political shape, and it was casting about for political shape. You had the Tea Party, you had Occupy, but it hadn't really cohered in the electoral sphere. And the right wing was poised to take advantage of it, and eventually they did take advantage of it with Donald Trump and Donald Trump's ties to, very, very sinister right wing figures like Steve Bannon. And if we had not had a left populist alternative for the first 5 years of the Trump phenomenon, I think that we possibly could have slid much further to the right in this country, and I think it's very possible that actually we would be facing a situation that is much closer to the actual the fascism that liberals are constantly claiming that Trump has inaugurated in this country. He hasn't. But it's very important that we had a left populist pole, and I think it's also incumbent on us to actually make sure that we keep that pole viable for this very reason, for the reason of responding to or behaving as an opposition to the right going forward. Micah?
Well, so not only is that one possible outcome that could have happened from this moment, and that obviously would have been the worst outcome, but also what would maybe be seen as more natural in a situation like this is that there's all of this roiling populist energy in society, and what you would normally expect to happen in that situation is that an Elizabeth Warren-like figure, somebody who emerges who's like a progressive, who will channel some of that anger in an electoral, political sort of a vaguely progressive direction, and use it kind of opportunistically, not necessarily in a bad way, in which that figure would take advantage of the situation, but would put it towards the end of a kind of amorphous progressivism. Instead, what we got out of the situation was a real ass democratic socialist being like democratic socialism. So we went from 0 to 100, and then reverse engineered all of these things like a reborn socialist movement that would not have come out of an Elizabeth Warren. If Bernie had never run in 2016 or 2020, we had that Elizabeth Warren-like figure, we wouldn't necessarily be also seeing this reborn socialist movement.
Well, if Bernie had gotten his way in 2016, right? Because he had initially wanted Elizabeth Warren herself to take his place, and when she wouldn't, that was when he stepped up.
I do feel like, there's a lot of shitting on Bernie by people for various reasons, whether it's Bernie betrayed us by endorsing Joe Biden, which he always said he was going to do, or whether it's here are all the mistakes that Bernie made. But I do feel like Bernie Sanders has single-handedly done so much to make American politics less horrendous over the last few years that I am reluctant to go too harshly after this old man who nearly gave up his life so that other people could have better lives, because it's so much better than it otherwise would have. But even, okay, we talk about counterfactuals, we talk about ideological victories, but one of the things you point out in the book is that there have been real gains that we can point to. It's not that, even over the course of this campaign, you talk about the way that Bernie has leveraged his national profile to boost strikers, to pressure successfully Amazon to increase their minimum wage. You talk about his time as mayor of Burlington. Bernie Sanders actually, often criticized and said, he had no accomplishments in Congress. Completely false, because actually for an independent who had almost no allies, he's extremely effective at getting real things through the narrow opening that you have in that position.
We also spend a lot of time in the book talking about the real material victories that have come from, and look, they're small right now, but they will be bigger if we continue to build the movement intelligently. But the material victories that have come out of the movement that has emerged in the wake of Bernie Sanders' first campaign, and Micah and I traded off writing about this. We tried to give concrete examples of what we were talking about and draw lessons from them. And Micah wrote two very good sections, one on Chicago and one on New York City. And I think those are very heartening examples. And Micah can speak more to this, but in Chicago, they have 12% of the city council is now DSA members, and in New York City and New York State, a broader coalition of socialists and progressives has come together to actually put people in office to affect real housing reform that has directly impacted the lives of working class New Yorkers.
Well, then, Micah, let me ask you about this, because I think one of the things that runs through the book is thinking about how much we can get through the electoral system and through the state. So if you look at a place like Chicago, or if you look at New York, having a bunch of DSAs on the city council sounds great. We did a Chicago episode of the podcast in which you talked a bit about this. But what can you actually get? What is the end game of getting people who are have a socialist affiliation into office? What have they managed to do in those cities that you feel like materially advance the socialist cause?
Well, the New York City section is maybe the most impressive in terms of tangible gains that have been made. In New York, there are two socialist elected officials at this point, AOC in the House, obviously, and Julia Salazar in the state Senate. And their elections, it's not as simple as saying, these socialists were elected and then they went and carried out a good and noble and valiant crusade. What happened in Chicago, what happened in New York, is that these socialists played an important role in helping change the discourse about the whatever social problems were under discussion as socialists. They played a unique role as socialists, but they also joined a broader progressive working class movement, movements that, by the way, in both the Chicago and New York cases, were not afraid to ally themselves with people who explicitly identified as socialists. So that's also an important issue here. In New York, it was through the two of them being elected as part of this broader progressive wave in New York, the removal of the IDC members of the Independent Democratic Caucus, I think it stood for, who were they were Democrats. They were officially registered as Democrats.
Supposedly Democrats, right? These are the people who
right.
are basically Republicans posing as Democrats.
Well, they caucused with the Republicans and prevented the passage of progressive legislation in the state of New York, and so.
He's the ones Andrew Cuomo was buddies with, right?
Exactly.
Sort of lifted into power.
It was a kind of good cop, bad cop routine where they were allying together to prevent any kind of progressive legislation in the state of New York. So with the end of the reign of the IDC, with the displacement of several IDC members and the election of several more progressive state senators, that combined with the sea change in public opinion on corporate giveaways, on the affordable housing crisis in New York City, all of these things joined together to allow for an opportunity to do two big things in New York City. One was block Amazon from moving into Queens. If you remember, this was something that was hugely being discussed about a year ago, that would have given away billions in public dollars to Amazon to move into Long Island City in Queens, which would have had ripple effects that would have displaced enormous numbers of working class New Yorkers and sent rents through the roof and all the rest of it. And that was successfully defeated. Amazon ended up moving, or is moving into Manhattan now, but without the enormous billions of dollars in public giveaways to them, and without moving into a place that would displace huge numbers of working class New Yorkers in the same way. And then also was the spate of affordable housing protections, the most significant that have been won in years in New York. Protections on all kinds of stuff like rent stabilized apartments, preventing landlords from engaging in certain kind of evictions. Real tangible gains that speak to the most acutely felt crises of working class New Yorkers under capitalism. In Chicago, the story is in some ways longer than just the election of half a dozen city council members who are socialists to the city council last year. The story really starts back in 2010 when a group of some socialists who were teachers who were socialists, as well as other teachers who were just pissed off about their union not being the kind of fighter against austerity that it could be in Chicago, took over the Chicago Teachers Union and transformed it into the militant democratic union that it is today, that is known for fighting on behalf of the entire Chicago working class. And so through that transformation of that union, and the union going on strike and doing all these things that people have hopefully heard about happening from Chicago, Chicago politics has been transformed. That union is now like makes up the left pole of politics in the city. There's the neoliberal centrist Democrats over here, like our current mayor, Lori Lightfoot, and Chicago Teachers Union, and the unions and community groups and progressives in their orbit. And so that opened up the space when half a dozen socialists ran for city council. They could actually be elected and, again, be part of that broader progressive working class movement in the city, and play huge roles on everything from affordable housing to being on the front lines of demanding that the city have a more progressive coronavirus response, all the rest of it. I mean, so all of that has happened because of a willingness to run as socialists and a willingness to work as part of a broader working class coalition. I mean, obviously, socialist movement is extremely weak right now. We can't win much on our own. There's nothing that we can win on our own, but you have to be part of that broader working class ferment, working class organizing unions, and the best of the labor movement and the best of community organizations and all the rest of it. And there are real opportunities to actually put wins on the board if we're able to do that.
I spend a lot of time thinking about the connection between ideas and material gains. And I got an email just yesterday from a guy who's a librarian in the Midwest who was saying that, reading current affairs helped radicalize him and participate in activism. And when the librarians were all told during the coronavirus crisis that they would have to use up their existing paid sick days in order to stay at home, they all sort of organized, and his participating in that organizing was flowed from his having been radicalized through reading left stuff, and eventually they won paid sick time through coronavirus. Now that's not a direct correspondence between left media and the material gain, but it is to say that, and I'm sure you've had the same experience with Jacobin, where you hear from and you talk to a lot of people who read Jacobin and they come to understand the kinds of things that they could have, the ways in which their lives could be different, the kinds of ways in which people have strived previously, the gains, the losses, the organizing tactics that worked, the ones that failed, and they start implementing those things in their own lives, in their own workplaces, in their own schools, and then there are small victories, and those small victories lead to other victories because those provide a model for other people. And we've seen a ton of that going on around the country, and it feels like we're in the early stages, but there are so many models now. You write about the things that are going on in Austin, where they also have a city council person, and they won paid time off there. So all of these ways in which it seems to me like it's actually quite clear how the left is winning and how we're moving and how that's actually affecting real people's real working lives.
I mean, the thing that we don't like about liberals' regard for ideas and ideology is that they believe that if you change hearts and minds, then the material world will simply follow, like mad. They don't have a materialist imagination or worldview about how society is constructed and what kinds of obstacles you are going to have to overcome in order to, fulfill the liberal values, dreams of equality and democracy and things like that. And what we believe as socialists is that actually you need to set people in motion. You need to set people in motion to engage in class struggle specifically, because most of the obstacles that you're going to encounter on the way to your dream society are in fact obstacles put in the way by the capitalist class, and they're put there structurally. They're not even just put there by like big, mean, greedy rich people. That's the part of the structure of society. And this is our main critique. I think people take it a little too far sometimes because they've just caught on to this. Maybe they were recently, they recently believed in this sort of like liberal hearts and minds idea themselves, and now they're rejecting that, and they're saying, ideas don't matter. Of course, ideas matter. Ideas naturally, if a person doesn't believe that they deserve anything more, that they don't believe that society can be different, or they believe that it's their own fault that their life is a life of struggle. And that, in fact, they should have been smarter, they should have got a better education. Maybe they just think they're shit out of luck and they should have been born to different parents. If people believe these things, they won't have the confidence to mobilize in their workplaces, in their communities, or wherever. And, in electoral politics, they won't have the I guess confidence is the right word to act. And when we talk about materialism, we're talking about the working class in motion against the capitalist class is the motor of history. But we are still talking about people in motion, and people are driven in large part by their ideas and by their imaginations about what's possible. And so, yes, it's extremely obviously very important for people to believe that there is an alternative. And if they're demoralized and they don't believe that there is an alternative, they won't set themselves into motion in the way that we want them to, and the way we need them to in order to affect actual fundamental transformational change. And I have, I guess, an anecdote to this effect. I mean, I have a million anecdotes to this effect. You can find them all over. In Eric Blanc's book, Red State Revolt, you can find examples of West Virginia teachers who became radicalized through the Bernie Sanders campaign and got together through DSA and helped, spark a nationwide teachers' strike wave. But the most current example right now is that there's an incredible organizing project that's currently underway to reach out to non-union workers who are really looking to fight right now, but who don't have unions to represent them. They're looking to fight the boss because of the coronavirus and the major economic disruptions that this has caused, or maybe they're frontline workers who don't have adequate personal protective equipment, or maybe they want hazard pay, or they want to be able to stay home and have their workplaces shut down, all these kinds of grievances. And right now, a militant union, United Electrical, and a socialist organization, the Democratic Socialists of America, have united in a joint project called the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee, EWOC, and they've received 700 calls, more than 700 calls so far, or 700 people have filled out this form, and they are putting dedicated organizers on the case people who are ideologically committed to building the labor movement, to building class struggle. And they're going through the intakes and they're assessing cases and they're connecting workers with resources and tools that they need and guiding them and steering them in their fight back against the boss, which is hopefully creating a layer of workplace leaders and workplace organizing infrastructure that would allow us to emerge from this crisis with a stronger labor movement than we went into it with, which is going to be extremely necessary in the recovery. And who are these people? They're people who read left. They're ideologues. They're socialists. They're people who are committed to this project because they have been convinced of the rightness of these politics. They have been convinced that the working class is the agent of revolutionary change and can bring about a world characterized by equality and democracy and solidarity. And a lot of them got into that position because of Bernie Sanders, actually. In fact, I know several people working on this project. I can tell you that they became socialists, they became members of the Democratic Socialists of America because they were inspired by Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders changed something about their ideas. So yes. Of course.
I think AOC is in that category, right? Explicitly came out of the first Bernie Sanders campaign. Well, that gets me to something that you think through a lot in the book, which is the relative weight of electoral campaigns, running candidates, getting people into office, using the mighty muscle of the state in order to try and put the boot on the neck of capitalists for once, and also the fact that we are not purely electorally or state-focused, and it's critical to have independent organizations, and you talk a lot about the labor movement and independent labor organizations and how to build those. So maybe you could say a few words about the relationship between these two things, these external institutions, and how much people should be thinking about politics as something that consists of finding socialist candidates and getting them on the city council and then trying to push through whatever progressive initiatives you have, versus trying to build other organizations and what those organizations are and do.
Yeah, I mean, we, in the book, after our initial chapter on Bernie and sort of lessons from his life, and we basically focus on two tracks. One is electoral work, the other is social movement work. And these are often spoken about as distinct things, like we can choose one or the other. This is how some people on the left talk about these things. But we've learned from the Bernie campaign and from some of these successful DSA electoral runs that have happened over the last couple of years that they're actually not somehow distinct phenomena. The Bernie Sanders campaign, running an election for trying to become the president of the United States, also helped stoke all of this other kind of, militant grassroots labor action and other kinds of social movement stuff. I mean, they're not just they're not distinct phenomena, but the way that you have, it's not an automatic thing. You have to go about that electoral work in a way that can stoke that kind of action. And that's what we refer to as class struggle elections. It's something a term that we didn't come up with ourselves. It was passed as the official strategy of the DSA at the convention in Atlanta last year. But it is an argument that when we go about electoral work, we should do so in a way that names our class enemies, that says, the reason we don't have nice things is that there's a 1%, the millionaires and billionaires who are hoarding all of the wealth, and that we need to fight them. We need to take them head on. They're not going to just nicely hand it over to us. They are our enemy, and they're going to keep trying to prevent us from having those nice things. So naming class enemies, building social movements through the elections, the electoral campaigns itself. Meagan wrote the section in our kind of case study chapter on the East Bay, in which Javanka Beckles was a DSA candidate who ran for state assembly. And the short version of the story is that she ran a noble campaign that East Bay DSA really threw itself into, but ultimately lost. But East Bay DSA used that infrastructure that came out of that campaign to then become the key player in supporting the Oakland Education Association when its teachers went on strike in 2019. And so the election was used as a way to build capacity for social movement work. And that's a critical part of class struggle elections, is building that bigger, building the social movement capacity through the act of engaging in elections themselves. And, we know, Megan and I were on a call last night with some students for Bernie organizers, and one of the last questions we got was, how can I become the next AOC, is I think how it was phrased. And our response was like, to be the next AOC is a noble thing to want to be. We need more AOCs. We need more Bernies. We need people running for elected office to help change the world. But we also need more of those same teachers who in 2010 were fed up with their union and got together and took over that union and turned the Chicago Teachers Union into this fighting institution. We need people who are rank and file members of their unions who are ready to fight within their unions to make them the fighting bodies that we know that they can be. We need people in their communities to be leading the fights against affordable housing. Like we need people who are at every level of the social movement work, not just running for elected office. We should be clear, one of the key lessons from this campaign is that electoral campaigns do really matter, and we can't, none of us can pretend that we would be in this situation with the reborn socialist movement and all the rest of it without the electoral work that Bernie and others have done. But we don't just need more people like Bernie at that level. We need people who are integrated into the working class, integrated into the working class movement at every single level if we're going to take advantage of these opportunities.
One of the things I like that you do in the book is, to me, one of the things that we often do on the left a little too much is we say the word organize, and we say everyone needs to organize, and we need strong progressive organizing, but we don't leave people with a very clear sense of what that would mean in their lives, the basic lessons of, take these abstract terms, class struggle, organizing, and turn those into, well, what does that mean for me in my day-to-day life? What do I get up and do? I can subscribe to Jacobin, I can donate to Bernie Sanders, but what do I do? And you give a lot of really clear examples of what people who do not have positions of power, who are not necessarily in a position to run for elected office, have been able to do, that has gotten people together and has moved things closer and closer locally in narrow conditions for their particular group, in their particular workplace, in their particular school.
I think that one thing that Bhaskar Sunkara, who's the editor-in-chief of Jacobin, once said that I liked a lot is that you rarely read a Jacobin article without coming away with your marching orders. For a long time on the left, this was actually considered a very bad thing. It was over-determined. You don't want to do that, right? There's this sort of like whole postmodern thing about grand narratives and like being didactic, and so the left discourse tended to be a little more hand-wavy and a little less conclusive. Jacobin, I think, as a magazine, one of the reasons that I was drawn to it just as a reader before I was a writer for Jacobin is like, I am really fed up and I really want to do something. And I'd like to know, I'd like some guidelines on what precisely a person might do in this situation that we're in. And I think that the book has a bit of that to it as well, in part because Mike and I just like come out of the culture of Jacobin. And so, yeah, there are marching orders in the book. People won't necessarily agree with them, but at least we've put them out there, and then people can offer alternative ideas if they don't think that our ideas are good, which I think is totally fair. But our ideas are that you should join a socialist organization. That is one of the main ones. You should join a socialist organization. And this is something that it's a quote that's sort of been circulated throughout the recent history of the socialist movement. An unorganized socialist is a contradiction in terms. You are just a fellow traveler who thinks that socialists are right, unless you are a member of a socialist organization. And it's up to you which one you want to join. I would recommend that you join the largest one and the one that has the most energy, which is Democratic Socialists of America. And so join a socialist organization. That's step one. There are other things that you can do through your socialist organization or whatever else, or that those include identifying potential places where you might be able to successfully run somebody with our ideals for office, and then actually building a campaign. Once again, this is a lot easier to do if you have an organization at your back. So a socialist organization could be useful in this regard. And then the other thing is either organize your workplace if your workplace is unorganized. If you exist in an organized workplace, contribute to the effort to, make that union a militant union, a democratic union, and just in general a union that stands for the interests of the broader working class. And if you neither have a unionized workplace nor you want to unionize your workplace, you have another option, which is that if you don't like your job, you can go get another job. A lot of people don't like their jobs. You can go get another job in a place that allows you to either organize anew or to participate in the labor movement from where you're actually working, from where you spend most of your time during the day. So these are some ideas that we have about what people can literally do with their lives. And not everybody is going to be able to do any of those three things, in which case maybe their relationship to the labor movement is that they play a key support role through, guess what, their socialist organization. So yeah, we have ideas about what we think people should literally do, and we welcome disagreement with those ideas, but they're all out there, they're concrete.
That's exactly why I say I would give this book to someone who is feeling hopeless and adrift. The last thing I just wanted to ask you is about the Democratic Party, because this is something you talk about in the book, the relationship between socialists and the Democratic Party. We are now in a situation where I think a lot of people on the left are very ready to give up on the party, because we have tried to take it over in the last two presidential elections, and now probably the worst of the primary candidates has successfully won. I mean, Joe Biden has spent his entire career completely hostile to left political goals, literally has signs that saying, "I'm not a socialist," right? People really don't feel at home in the Democratic Party. They feel like pretty much every establishment figure in the Democratic Party hates them, which they do. And you write in the book that ultimately we probably need another party. The Democratic Party is an inherently capitalist party, but also I get the impression that you would counsel people against just washing their hands of it completely and saying we want nothing to do with Democrats again.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of leftists understandably being very frustrated by this party, which is a fundamentally capitalist party, and finding their efforts to make progressive change through the party stymied, which is what the party infrastructure is designed to do. It's designed to smash those kinds of attempts to make progressive change happen, which, by the way, is different from like almost every other country around the world, certainly almost every other wealthy country around the world. You look at Canada. Canada has like a social democratic party, the New Democratic Party. People know about the Labour Party in the UK. I mean, that is more of a normal situation to be in most wealthy countries around the world. Those parties have their own problems, to be sure, but like they're not as fundamentally a capitalist party as the Democrats are. So people shouldn't be surprised when the Democratic Party continues to engage in this kind of war on any kind of progressive ideals in the future. But there are also really significant structural barriers towards forming a third party in this country. That's the reason why we don't have one. It's not because people love the Democrats. It's because there are all these barriers towards breaking them. And so we advocate for what, we get our ideas from Seth Ackerman and Eric Blanc, who have written in Jacobin electoral strategies that, Eric Blanc calls the dirty break, which is, in contrast to the clean break, where you just cleanly cleave from the Democrats, you're done with them, you're not engaging with them anymore. The dirty break strategy involves basically the path beyond the Democrats goes through the Democrats, but it goes through the Democrats in engaging with that party in a specific way, in a way that is very sober about the fact that this party hates your guts and wants to see you destroyed, which is, of course, what Bernie has done, right? Bernie's campaign. Bernie has never been a member of the Democratic Party. If you read his first memoir, he quotes the now defunct U.S. Labor Party when he says, like, the bosses have, the bosses have two parties. We need one of our own. Like, he's like, who could disagree with that? And he's like, yes. Bernie recognizes that there's something deeply wrong with the Democratic Party, but he ran to be the head of that party, and in doing so exposed that party's failings to millions of Americans day in and day out, like especially young people, I think, who this election or the 2016 was their first presidential election. They saw this guy who's just like, we could have some nice things here, like Medicare for all, and they saw the party move heaven and earth to destroy him, and they're like, what's going on with this party? Like, why? I thought they were the left-wing party. I thought they were the party of the people. Why are they doing this? Like, it's exposed the Democratic Party at its highest levels as being a real enemy of working people. And so our contention is that through that kind of engagement with the party, with a level of independence from the party, preferably, with a group like the DSA that you're a part of, who can kind of discipline you and act as an influence to preventing you from, going to the right. Because of course there's a whole history in the United States of progressives, people with good politics joining the Democratic Party because it's the only game in town, and then being pulled rightward and being conservatized and having all of their hopes and dreams and aspirations smashed. So we don't want to allow that to happen. And the best way to do that is to be a part of a group that can discipline you, like the DSA. But yeah, the hope is that long term, through that continual level of engagement with the party, using the party's ballot line when it makes sense, but being very sober about the party, remaining independent from it, recognizing that its establishment are not your friends, that it's sometime in the future, we don't know when, that will produce enough energy to eventually break with that party and create an actual working class party or a socialist party or whatever presents itself. But that is a real central task going forward. And it's central. I probably don't need to lecture anybody on this, but it is central to remember that this party, its leadership, its establishment are not your friends, and they're not going to let up on their war against progressive ideals anytime soon.
So, Meagan, let me ask you: Do you endorse Joe Biden?
No, I mean, I'm not a politician anyway. What are people asking my endorsement for?
It's so funny.
When I endorsed, it's funny. It's weird. It's like everyone's expected to endorse now. It's funny because when I appeared to very strongly endorse Bernie Sanders, people were like, aren't you a reporter? Aren't you supposed to be objective? Why are you saying that you are for a politician? And now people are like, so do you endorse Joe Biden?
Why haven't you released your endorsement?
It's like, nobody knows. I mean, I as far as I'm concerned, endorsements are for organizations and for politicians, and I'm under no obligation to endorse a politician. I was endorsing Bernie Sanders because I'm a socialist, and I think that, he was poised to advance the goals of our movement better than anyone in, a century. And so that was a unique situation, right? Like, I'm not in the business of endorsing candidates. And the other question is always, will you vote for Joe Biden? Well, guess what? I live in California, so, it doesn't really matter what I say to that. And you will not get an answer out of me.
Well, how do you think about, though, the lesser evil question? What do we do when we end up with these shitty nominees?
Well, obviously, we would.
Go ahead, Micah.
All right. Nobody with half a brain, nobody with half a brain cell wants to see Donald Trump reelected. Obviously, we all want to see this guy disappear. But it also means something to endorse someone and to really throw your energy and efforts behind them. And why people, who are backing Biden, people within the Democratic Party, think that they can declare war on us, say explicitly over and over, you guys have those ideals. We do not believe in your ideals. We are going to do everything we can to destroy your candidate. You're going to say that we need something like Medicare for all. We're going to say, no, we're not going to do Medicare for all. They're going to, every step of the way, they're going to tell us that they're trying to make us eat shit. And then when they emerge victorious, they're like, so where's your endorsement of us? I'm like, you just shit on me for years. Like, this is not like you're not my dom. Like, I'm not here to reward you for treating me like garbage for the last couple of years. Like, I think people, it makes sense if you're in a swing state to vote for Joe Biden, but I don't think that socialists should lift a finger for this guy who declared war on us. Like, no, you suck. We're not going to get behind you. We get behind people who believe in the things that we believe in. Sorry.
And furthermore, I mean, I think that what are they asking for if they're not asking for our votes? I mean, as far as voting goes, I completely agree with Micah. Look, if you live in a swing state, that is your call. But I think probably people are just intelligent enough to be able to like discern for themselves whether or not they would like to have a Joe Biden presidency or a Donald Trump presidency, and to figure out what their own relationship to that is based on where they live. Like, I just trust people on that. Personally, obviously, I believe that if Joe Biden presidency would be a much better situation, both for the working class of this country and for our movement to organize in, than a Donald Trump presidency, which really isn't saying much. I want to clarify, that's not really saying much. So, but yeah, at the same time, like, we have to. Why is the left never regarded as like a constituency worth courting or wooing or otherwise, being mindful of not alienating? We're always regarded as a constituency worth squashing. And I don't think that we should reward that behavior with docility in this moment, right? Like, we've been, literally, Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg were calling DSA's, 5-organization coalition with other organizations in support of Bernie Sanders. They were calling us a shadowy super PAC. I don't think that we owe the Democratic Party establishment our undying fealty after those kinds of hijinks. I mean, I think that I'd like to at least play hard to get, because, well, first of all, Micah's right. We shouldn't be endorsing people who we don't actually. Their ideals do not align with ours, or are indeed hostile to ours, because that would be basically a liquidation of our identity as a socialist organization, and then we're worthless. But it's also the case that, like, I think that we need to announce ourselves as the left as a constituency that's worth triangulating around. The Democratic Party is constantly triangulating around suburban moderate swing voters. Why not us? Well, the only way to actually get through to them, that they need to start triangulating with us in mind, is to play a little bit hard to get. So even if that means that we're going to get yelled and screamed at for being traitors and Trumpists and whatever, I think it's worth just dealing with the abuse for a few months in order to just not roll over quite so easily. And of course, Bernie Sanders is different from us. He has a different set of considerations. He always said he was going to endorse. He's done it now. I came to peace with it long ago. But we have a different role in society, I think.
Well, Meagan Day and Micah Uetricht, thank you so much for talking to me. The book is bigger than Bernie. It is practical, it is wise, and everyone should read it.
Thank you so much, Nathan.
Always a pleasure talking to you.